What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And last week we checked out some cards in the modern format that for one reason or another cannot come back to the format, whether they were too powerful, they were a part of too many combos, they synergize too well with the current cards that we have in the format, what have you. And I felt like we could do the same thing with the Pioneer format, strictly for the fact that we've had a lot of powerful cards kind of come through the Pioneer format that in turn have made some very powerful strategies in the format that ultimately needed to get banned or nerfed in some way, and these cards were kind of, in the line of fire when it comes to those sort of things. So we're going to be taking a look at 5 cards in the Pioneer ban list that absolutely cannot come back to the format. I don't think that they offer enough or change anything, or they're even okay for them to come back just simply on the merits of, not being healthy for the format, not creating a healthy metagame, and with, the problems that the Pioneer format has had up until really this Pioneer RCQ season where things seem to have kind of calmed down and the metagame has shifted, I don't think that these can come back, to try to polarize the metagame in one direction or another. So, of course, before we get too deep into the list and we talk about the cards and everything like that this week, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where I post a lot about the Pioneer and modern format, along with some other longer form videos. So if any of that interests you, again, subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell. Super easy and free way to support me and my content as we try to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So I'd appreciate any and all help I can get in trying to reach that goal. And with all that said, let's go ahead and look at an honorable mention, which probably isn't surprising for a lot of people because it's probably some of the best land cycles ever printed in Magic. So let's go ahead and take a look at our honorable mention here. So our honorable mention is the cycle of fetched lands from Khans of Tarkir, recently getting reprinted in Modern Horizons 3. This is pretty obvious, having half a cycle of fetch lands. We have the shock lands, we have the triomes and whatnot. Mana bases would be really, really, really good in the format. Short of having the other half of the fetch land cycle, I mean, this would really just create a ton of 3 and 4 color decks. And we kind of saw this when these fetch lands were legal, along with the Tango lands from the Battle for Zendikar cycle of cards. And of course, I want to say, I don't think fetch lands were legal when we got the cycle lands that had the same basic land types. But, this is just in a format where currently all the delve spells are still legal, or at least the really good ones are still legal. And again, having just already really good mana bases, with lands that have basic land types, fetch lands would just kind of put that over the top. People would play more delve spells. I think the blue decks would be very good. Just the fact that they have 2 blue fetch lands and even, 2 red fetch lands and stuff, even though they can't, even though they don't have Scalding Tarn and whatnot. But I just don't think that these can come back simply on the merit of mana bases being, way too good and way too consistent, on top of just being able to, be those extra cards to help fuel, treasure cruises and dig through times and whatnot. I don't know if this would necessarily make Dig Through Time, playable, but definitely Treasure Cruise being played in probably more blue decks than just something like Is It Phoenix is probably a good enough reason to leave fetch lands out of the format, and it at least makes Pioneer feel a little bit more different from the modern format in terms of, aside from just the decks that are actually available to play in the format, the games end up playing out a lot different, between the mana bases and the actual cards being played. So that's our honorable mention. Fetch lands should definitely just stay banned. Let's keep the Pioneer format, a fetchless or a mostly fetchless format. So yeah, that's our honorable mention. Let's go ahead and take a look at our first official card of our list. First up, we have the card Nexus of Fate. This card has a very special place in my heart because I remember playing in a standard tournament where Nexus of Fate was legal and people were playing, Blue-Green Nexus, Bant Nexus, things like that. And I actually made someone absolutely just rage quit a tournament in round 1 from just looping Nexus of Fate and, getting to Teferi Ultimate and things like that. And while it's kind of a fun story in the fact that this is something that's never happened to me before, and literally just picked up their stuff and left the whole tournament in the first round of a 4 or 5 round tournament. But that's kind of I think the consensus of Nexus of Fate and kind of how rage inducing it was, because really a lot of the time people just didn't realize, like, necessarily maybe how this card worked. I mean, super simple, 7 mana, instant, take an extra turn after this one, and if it's put in the graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it and then shuffle it back into its owner's library. So it's like an extra turn spell, where a lot of the extra turn spells that were printed at the time, you know, were, again, like 6-7 mana, and they exiled themselves, where this one just kept going back into your library. And when you get to mix other cards like Search for Azcanta, where you just get to dig for more cards, you end up getting to play, you know, in Pioneer, dig through Time Treasure Cruise and whatnot, to kind of get to that point, you're able to stall out the game to where, you know, you're basically guaranteed to find a Nexus of Fate every turn, essentially taking the rest of the turns for the game, and then, you know, whatever your win condition is, you know, in most cases, your opponent's getting bored, and as soon as you put a 1/1 into play, they're like, okay, yeah, I'm eventually going to die to this thing anyway, so let's go ahead and play another game. This card offers absolutely zero benefit to the format, other than for, like, making me, like, happy, because I would buy, like, so many copies of these cards. I wouldn't even care if the deck wasn't necessarily good. I would definitely be jamming Nexus of Fate into any blue deck that I could possibly play it in. You know, and the reality is that even if this card, you know, came back and it was totally fine, I just think the potential play patterns that it caused and the play patterns that it did cause back in the day of being in Standard and kind of what we saw, you know, in, like, on Arena and best of one formats and whatnot, Nexus of Fate is probably better off just staying banned for the fact that it's, you know, very abusable, having someone just take all of the extra turns, being able to, you know, play into having draws because you're just never, like, I can't win the game, but I can take all the extra turns and, you know, essentially take minor game actions that keep moving the game forward, but technically not moving the game forward, and either you're going to concede the game or I'm going to just have this end up being a draw. You know, plenty of times where I've played in matches where, you know, I'm trying to win the game, go to time, and then you just take all, you know, 5 or 6 turns of extra turns, and, you know, you're just not able to, like, close out the game fast enough with that. So I think just overall something that just shouldn't exist in the Pioneer format, while it is a card that holds a special place in my heart because it is, you know, part of, like, my streak at that time where, you know, just top 8ing, you know, qualifier events and things like that, you know, across multiple formats, and, like, this is my deck of choice. And even though, again, it would bring me great happiness to cast Nexus of Fate in a tournament setting once again, you know, in a format that isn't modern, overall, for probably everybody's sanity and possibly my own, Nexus of Fate should absolutely 100% stay on the ban list, and then never, ever, ever print a card like this. And as you can see at the bottom too, as well, like the kicker and all this, it was a buy a box promo, so you couldn't even, like, open this up in packs or anything. It was literally like you had to buy a box to get this promo, and I was very fortunate that it was, like, well enough after, like, M19's release that I was able to actually buy, like, the promos and stuff like that from the store that I got them from. So yeah, Nexus of Fate, absolutely stupid, just insane, infuriating card, and is the first card in our list that should absolutely never, under any circumstances, come back to the Pioneer format. So let's go ahead and move on to another notable card that was pretty busted at its time in being allowed in constructed formats. At number 2, we have Luris the Dream Den, a card that pre and post nerf had 2 probably Hall of Fame careers for, like, a Magic card, and that is, like, no joke. So Luris is a 1 generic and then a double white and black hybrid for a 3/2 legendary creature, Cat Nightmare, with the companion mechanic, probably one of the most busted mechanics, you know, ever conceived of in Magic. Especially pre-nerf companion was absolutely just bonkers. So the companion, like, requirement for this is each permanent card in your starting deck has converted mana cost 2 or less. Where you had Karuga, which cared that every card, like every spell in your deck, or I believe non-land, however it was worded, basically, like, only your lands could cost 3 or less mana. You know, instant sorceries, enchantments, you know, planeswalkers, whatever card type you could think of. You know, Karuga required you to play those cards with a converted mana cost of 3 or greater. Luris has, like, the opposite, you know, requirement, but it's only permanent cards. So you could play, you know, things like Cooligan's Command, which are, like, 3 mana instants in your deck. You could play things like Murderous Cut, you know, a 6 mana instant and whatnot, and you could still have Luris as a companion. And already there kind of sets it apart from some of the other companions, because you could tell that there were, like, mere copies of other cards. Like, you had Yumori, which could, you played every non-land card in your deck had to be like a card of like the same type. So you had to play all enchantments, all creatures, what have you, if you wanted to have access to Yumori. And then you had like Lutri, which required you to play one-ofs of all your non-land cards. And Luris, basically got to do what Karuga wanted to do, but a hell of a lot better. So basically, for all this work, you get a creature that is a 3/2 lifelinker that during each of your turns, you may cast one permanent spell from your with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. And when I say 2, like Hall of Fame careers, like going back to that, pre-nerf, I believe even with like the nerf happening to it, it was just absolutely dominating Vintage. This and Zedru or Zerdu or Zerdo, whatever the hell that card is. These were absolutely running people over in Vintage. Legacy, Luris was seeing a ton of play. Modern, Luris really saw a lot of play. And in Pioneer as well, it just made, decks a lot grindier. Just like how a card that'll show up later on this list where, if you played it fairly, it was kind of okay, and when I say kind of okay, I mean, like, you'll probably know what card I'm talking about, but getting to draw like 4, 5, 6 cards as like being like a fair thing where it's just like 2 mana, I'm going to completely, 2 mana, I'm going to one-sided like Wheel of Fortune or whatever is, absolutely just crazy. So like pre-nerf, like Luris, just being able to cast it from outside the game one time in a match. And the longer this card stuck around, the higher percentage you had of winning the game. And paying 3 mana, guess what? Still didn't matter because Luris was just going to absolutely grind your opponent into dust if they could never, ever, ever deal with Luris in many forms of like Grixis Shadow and Modern to, obviously the decks getting to play Power 9 in Vintage, to even this card being in Standard and like white-black Aristocrats decks. This card was just absolutely nuts. This cannot come back, and I don't know if there's anything you can do to this card that you could make it okay for it to come back, and then it see some play, but then not be as oppressive as it has been. I think you have to make this card unplayable to be able to bring it back to the format, and at that point, there's just no point. You might as well just leave it banned. If people aren't going to be able to play with it, then there's no reason to like bring it back or make further nerfs and stuff with the companion mechanic. We all know that it was kind of a mistake, even though it was admittedly kind of like a cool and fun idea to like kind of force like deck restrictions on players to get access to a very powerful card. This card just might be a little too powerful, and like I said, any changes you make to it, I think just make it unplayable. So that's Luris the Dream Den. That is our number 2 card. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next card on our list. So I think this one was pretty easy to add on the list. I think this card in particular is probably better than the other 2 in terms of the fact that we saw what Karn the Great Creator was able to accomplish in the Pioneer format for how long in even just one singular archetype in the format. So Karn the Great Creator, 4 colorless mana, or 4 generic mana, for a 5 loyalty planeswalker that says activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. +1, you can turn a non-creature artifact into an artifact creature with power toughness equal to its converted mana cost. And -2, you can choose an artifact you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card and put it to your hand. Now, we all know about Mono Green Devotion. We know that currently, as it stands right now, seems to be on the up and up, getting to do the thing that you kind of want Mono Green to do. You just want them to like snowball into bigger and bigger things and create like boards with giant creatures in it. Well, back in the day, as late as the end of last year, Karn the Great Creator was like, hey, I'm going to not only be played in an archetype that just can generate tons and tons of mana early on and can already kind of like win the game by creating these boards with like very efficient 3 mana 4/4s and 5 mana 5/6s that are going to ramp you and whatnot. I'm going to then be able to be played in that deck and create a sideboard where I'm going to have a silver bullet for every matchup that could potentially be bad, have an answer for any kind of threat that could potentially threaten the deck that I am in, And on top of that, too, I'm going to be able to essentially create infinite Planeswalker activations, infinite mana, and then just completely mill my opponent and get as much information as I need for the games going forward. So, Karn the Great Creator, some quick combos. You had like Pestilent Cauldron that you could go get from the sideboard. You could cast Restorative Burst. You could get back, a Karn and a Kiora. And as long as your devotion, I believe, was like 15 or whatever, like you could just do that and like generate infinite mana. Your opponent was going to gain like a ton of life, but I mean, it really wasn't going to matter because again, you're going to create infinite mana and whatnot, and kind of keep doing it until you could play something like the Chain Veil, and then you could just activate Chain Veil a bunch of times, untap it with Kiora, continue to give all your Planeswalkers extra activations, and once you activated, the Chain Veil like 7, 8, 9 times, you were going to be able to activate Kiora enough to be able to get in the graveyard, to where then you could like activate Karn enough times to like go and pick those those Planeswalkers up. And then get to the point where Karn was going to have enough, activations on it to where you're going to be able to minus, go get the Stone Brain, look at your opponent's hand, name a card. You're going to keep like naming cards out of your opponent's deck until, they had no cards in the library. Then you're going to name a card in their hand, and then they're going to draw from an empty library and lose the game. Things that mono green should be doing. And that's cannot be said with any more sarcasm. Literally, like, the fact that Mono Green had this and had it for so long is absolutely asinine. And the fact that, it just made games, like, nowhere near any fun to play against Mono Green. Because at least that, if they had to find a way to win the game by just, like, playing a ton of big creatures and turning them sideways or whatever, or playing, like, big, green X spells to kind of like dump their mana into and like play out games that way and stuff, was fine. But the fact that you had Karn the Great Creator, which could just extend combos and basically make it impossible for your opponent to try and win the game, when you could just, make a ton of mana, slam a Karn, and then go into your sideboard and find a sideboard card that absolutely hoses your opponent and what they're trying to do, is not very fun. And, while it definitely sucks to, lose games to like combo decks and whatever, it also sucks being the combo deck and knowing that like you have a theoretical like edge in like game ones, only to play against like mono green and they just have like a ton of green pips on like turn 2, turn 3 they slam a Karn, and then they exile your win condition, and then you're essentially left with nothing, and you have to wait for the mono green player to like kill you and stuff. So ultimately, I think Karn the Great Creator is a net positive banned for the format, and I think as we print better and better artifacts into formats, and as, Nykthos and all these other big mana decks kind of continue to see success, and I think if Mono Green is even seeing success now in a format like post-Karn, even though it took a little bit of time, I think it's probably a good thing that Karn just stays as far away as it can from any powerful format and just kind of, fades into kind of like darkness. But, of course, in Modern, like, it's not really the most played card in that format right now either. You have Tron that plays it, but, it's definitely not nearly as oppressive as it was in Pioneer and even like Legacy and Vintage as well. So that's our number 3 card, Karn the Great Creator. You can just go like dive headfirst into a whole Karn. Like, I don't want to see you anymore. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our second to last card of our little list here. Our second card, and probably arguably, 1A to 1B or 1B to 1A, however you want to put it. I think this card and the next card absolutely, under zero circumstances, probably should even exist. So Winota Joiner of Forces is 2 generic, a red and a white, for a 4/4 legendary creature, Human Warrior. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains Indestructible until end of turn, and you put the rest of the cards in the bottom library in a random order. So while this effect, it's like, well, you need creatures to attack. How is this not fair? Well, considering that in the early days of like Pioneer and kind of in that time where I really wasn't playing, but I was kind of following the format. Just watching people go like 1-drop into like 2-drop that makes 2 non-humans into like a 3-drop that, could make more non-humans, to like slamming Winota and just like making spot removal like absolutely silly. And, of course, like if you didn't, essentially Winota was like a kill on sight creature. And even if you killed like Winota on site, you still had a ton of other creatures that your opponent was playing that kind of needed answers to it as well, because they were just like a Winota away from dying. So like the fact that, this was just a kill on sight card. And then the creatures in its deck that it found just ended up being able to win the game. I believe there's like Hellevar Huntmaster or whatever it was. It was like a 6-mana human that like made 2/2/2 wolves when it entered the battlefield. So like, and I believe whenever it attacks too. But since it's tapped and attacking, it doesn't get that trigger. But you still just put more bodies into play that are going to be able to trigger Winota on a later turn. And then you had like Blade Historian, which gave your attacking creatures double strike. You got to play the Agent of Treachery to go steal your opponent's permanents, what have you. And when you get like 3 or 4 triggers from a Winota, you know, that's essentially 24 cards you get to look at, almost half of your deck, and really you're probably half of your deck by the time you actually are able to play Winota, to find, you know, a Huntmaster, to find an Agent of Treachery, to find Blade Historian, to find all these powerful humans that are just going to add tons of bodies to the board, where, you know, short of something like Supreme Verdict, or even like nowadays like Sunfall and what have you, you know, you weren't going to be able to win. And you know, you could essentially just like find a Winota off of, you know, your own Winota trigger, legend rule it, and you essentially had a 4/4 with haste, like attacking, you know, on that same turn. And again, like whenever you added Blade Historian to the mix, you know, you just ended up one-shotting your opponent. And even if they had enough creatures to block, the fact that your creatures had double strike just meant that you were going to more than likely win combat, decimate your aggro opponent's board, and they weren't really going to be able to respond with like a win either. So probably in the grand scheme of things, as far as, you know, like aggro decks and stuff are concerned, Winota, again, probably shouldn't come back. You know, it's just a card that can generate a ton of value. You know, you're either going to put a ton of like Agent of Treacheries in play, steal all your opponent's permanents, all their relevant permanents anyway, you know, and they're not really going to be able to interact with them until their next turn anyway, and you're still going to be able to keep control of those permanents, to just straight up dying if this card, you know, resolves and gets to survive the attack step. You know, if you're able to trigger it after you attack and whatnot. So Winota can stay banned. Kind of wish I got to play this deck at least a little bit when it was legal, but like I said, overall, probably a good idea that this card stays on the ban list and probably never comes back, especially with, you know, more powerful and versatile humans being printed with every single set that is, you know, released into standard. So that's Winota joining our forces. That is probably the 1B of, you know, of the kind of this list if we're ranking them. But I think, you know, with personal bias and just being able to kind of experience the format, I think this next card, you know, probably takes the cake as like the least likely to ever be unbanned and put back into the Pioneer format. Our last card probably has at least some merit of being considered one of the greatest enchantment spells of all time, and possibly one of the most abused cards of all time in Underworld Breach. So this card, 2-mana enchantment, 1 generic and a red. Each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard, which means that you can cast, you know, you can cast a spell from your graveyard for their escape cost, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice Underworld Breach. So this is an enchantment that just gets to stick around, where you play this on turn 2, and it's like, all right, my spells have escape, you know, and your opponent has to like interact with the enchantment. At the end step, it is going to go away. So you essentially, you know, pay 2 mana to at least cast like 1 spell in your graveyard, which, you know, normally isn't all that great. But when we talk about the Pioneer format and like what this card meant, it was in the middle of, you know, a 2-deck format where we had Inverter combo and we had, you know, the Lotus Field combo deck. And this one in particular being a key piece of the Lotus Field deck, where, you know, you were playing this with cards like Tome Scour so that you could, you know, basically just mill yourself and just keep putting cards in your graveyard and building up your graveyard to the point where, all right, now I'm going to be able to cast like Hidden Strings and be able to untap all my, you know, both my Lotus Fields and generate tons of mana. Keep casting Tome Scour until you eventually mill all the cards in your, you know, in your library, and then you end up going to the sideboard, getting a Jace Wielder of Mysteries thanks to the wish granted part of Fave Wishes, and then, you know, essentially just mill your opponent, draw a card from an empty library, and you win the game with Jace's static ability, you know, and that's just kind of how Lotus Field decks played at the time. Either that or your opponent had a stroke because they're trying to figure out how the heck you're doing this all on turn 3. But that's, the long and the short of it. I mean, Underworld Breach getting to do those sort of things in just the Pioneer format, in a format that is significantly less powerful compared to Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. And even speaking of those formats, like while Underworld Breach isn't necessarily a dominating force in Modern like it is in Pioneer, Legacy, Vintage when it was legal, still kind of brought the concept of like value breaches where, you played this like on, turn 2 or turn 3, maybe you had like 1 or 2 Dragon Rage channelers going, and you were able just to cast like Mishra's Bauble and then like mill cards, and then, cast Bauble again and mill more cards, and just keep drawing cards, sacrificing whatever, until eventually you drew like 5 or 6 cards on your opponent's turn, and you essentially like gassed back up, and then are set up to, if you cast another Underworld Breach, you're going to be able to, continue to hit your land drops and get to a point where, when you cast your second or third Breach, you're going to be able to cast Lightning Bolt like 4 or 5 times and kill your opponent, wherever necessary, so, yeah, I mean, Underworld Breach just overall is kind of a messed up Magic card, especially in formats where, 0 cost artifacts are very playable, like Lion's Eye Diamond, in Legacy, Black Lotus in Vintage, even, again, like we said, like Mishra's Bauble in Modern. And even though Pioneer doesn't have really a 0-mana artifact that can sacrifice itself and generate some value either by card advantage or producing extra mana, it didn't need it. And just as I stated before, it was in the middle of a 2-deck format where, you had people playing Lotus Field, you had people playing the Inverter combo, and then you had everybody else that decided they wanted to actually try to have fun in the format, but then immediately finding out that there was no way to have fun with 2 decks that are trying to win the game, like on, for Lotus Field, like win the game on like turn 3, and then, the Inverter deck winning on like turn 4 or turn 5, so, I mean, overall, Breach just doesn't add anything to the Pioneer format. Doesn't really add anything to any format besides Modern, where it's kind of mid there, but this card is just absolutely nuts everywhere else. And I think the fact that now we kind of have an idea that like you can build a Breach deck and it doesn't have to necessarily be a all-in, like I'm going to play this and, I'm going to try to combo off and win the game that turn. The fact that now we kind of have like this new knowledge and different ways of building Breach decks to where we can just play them and they're kind of like these value engines rather than just being a card that, with the right cards in graveyard, when I play this, I'm going to be able to win the game. Just makes it even more versatile, makes it more appealing of a card that if it got brought back to the format that a lot of people would start playing it again. And I just think that a design like this probably shouldn't come back. I don't think this card adds anything to the Pioneer format going forward. And obviously, like a lot of the cards on this list and a lot of cards like Period are going to get a lot better as, more powerful cards end up getting printed and added to the format. And I just don't think we need that. I think Underworld Breach can stay banned. And, just like Luris, I think if you had found a way to bring it back, I don't think it's nearly as good. You're essentially going to like nerf it to the point where if you brought it back, no one would have it see play, or in like very extreme circumstances, it would be a very playable card. And I just don't think it's like worth going through all that hassle to just try to make a worse version of this card that is playable when it's not really, solving a problem that the format has. So, that's my take. Underworld Breach is probably, of the cards that we mentioned, is probably, the card that like absolutely, if ban 1, the rest come back, like this card's just staying banned, like without question, full stop, in my opinion, after getting to actually play with this card. So that's the last card on our list, and that's gonna do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video, comment down below if there's a card that I did not mention here that cannot be unbanned in the Pioneer format. I know that there's quite a few cards that we could have looked at that could not, could basically like come back and whatever. So I'm curious to see what you all think. What do you think of the list? How would you rank these, and so on and so forth. Subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell. Free, easy ways to support me and my content. Again, on the road to 1K subscribers, so I would appreciate any and all help we can get. And that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'll have to see you all in the next one.